is as if dead, because they're so terrible. And remember, the word trefa comes from the Hebrew word for tearing. And what it meant was someone who had been attacked originally by a wild animal and had been disemboweled, basically. Not dead yet, but absolutely no way they wouldn't be dead soon. So that shows how old that tradition is. So those are descriptions of a status. This person is as if dead. There we go. And what we always think of in its broadest sense is descriptive of a state of physiological status. That is, the person is no longer alive in the physiological sense. The other thing that's important to understand, and as a sociologist what I deal with all the time, is that the idea of how death is embedded in social relationships in many different ways, which includes our definitions of death, which are socially embedded, as I'll show you. There are other societies that define death differently. But also all of the behaviors that surround death, and they can be many different kinds. So we could have someone on life support systems. We could decide to withdraw those life support systems, and in that sense, initiating to us the process of dying or the process of death. Then we can actually do it. We can stop life support systems. We can declare death. Officially, not we can, but Tammy can. Right? We give certain people with certain statuses in our society the right to declare officially this person is dead. Then there is potential second death behavior, I call it. And that means the person is declared brain dead, and so for legal purposes they're dead, but we maintain them on organ support systems, which can happen for years, and then at some point they're taken off, and to the family, that's a second death. Even if they bought and understood and accepted the idea that the person was dead, and I'll show you some examples of that. Then we procure organs, we begin the mourning process, we initiate funeral processes, and then there are these death consequences. We read the will. We create a successor for that person in an official capacity. Then we have another category of problematic death, death assumed. So, what happens when you don't have the body? Someone is lost at sea. Someone is missing in action. This became a big issue, again, in a couple of communities, such as the Orthodox Jewish community after 9/11, because a lot of those bodies were not recovered. So there was an assumption of death, but no proof of death. And so if you are the wife of a man who you assume was killed in the collapse of the Twin Towers, but no body was found, when can you declare that person dead for all the purposes that you need to do that? So that's another set of problems. Someone can be considered dead for every purpose, and yet we never actually have a physiological examination of that person. We never actually see the process or examine the process of dying. And this was tragically, there we go, happened to an uncle of Jimmy Carter's. Tom Gordy was captured in World War II, was away for many, many years, was pronounced dead by the Army. His wife remarried, and then he reappeared, having been finally released, to find his wife married to someone else. Tragic situation. But how do you handle that situation? Every society, every ancient society that we've ever found had to have a policy for this, because people went missing all the time in ancient society. They went out to hunt and were killed by an animal and never found. They went out to sea and their ships sank. So this is a very important part of the way in which we think about death. Spiritually, and by the way, those are moral decisions, ethical decisions we make about the nature of death, every one of them. When do we decide that enough time has passed to declare someone dead? How do we determine which kinds of rituals and activities we're going to go through to create the social aspects of death and dying? Then spiritually, and of course there are many, many, many other things we could talk about in terms of moral and ethical death, but I'm just trying to give you a taste. Spiritual death. Interestingly, if you look back at portraits of death in history, you see this interesting dichotomy. You see these very, very kind of scary, negative, death is this horrible thing where this very scary creature comes and takes you away. And you also see many portraits of benevolent death. Death as the angel that whisks you away, that cradles you in her arms as you pass on to the next world. Both of those portraits of death are in the ancient world. As well as medieval woodcuts of death are some of my favorite things to look at. You see in all three of these, the same thing is happening. You have an individual, this is a monk, that's a king, that's a tradesman. You have a skeletal death that comes and takes them away. And in all three instances, they're surprised. But my favorite of these is this one. I love this woodcut. So here's the trader. He's got all his stuff on his back. He's on his way. Death has grabbed him, and he's saying, no, I've got something to do. Can't have me. But of course, death is not to be denied, and the assumption of this woodcut is that death wins and the trader loses. Americans profoundly believe in life after death. If you look at this, this is a Pew Research study from 2010, so it's recent. You'll see that almost across the board, age-wise, religious affiliation-wise, except unaffiliated, drops by about 33%. Doesn't really matter what your religion is. There's only a 10% variance. Americans believe that there is life after death. So if you believe that, then death means one thing. If you don't believe that, death means something very different. And so part of the spiritual aspect of how we think about death depends not on what you think about death, necessarily, but what you think about what happens after death. Physically. Well, when we talk about physical death, that's what most of us think about. That's what we really care about. How do we know physically when someone is dead? That's what we care about in terms of the big giant health system over there. It's what we care about legally. The law doesn't care if you're morally, ethically, or spiritually dead. They only care if you're physically dead. And those of us, people who aren't really involved in death and dying in any intimate way, in a medical way or a healthcare way, often think that this is a very clear thing. We've seen dead things, and they look very different than living things. But in fact, death is a complex process. There is dispute about how you determine if someone is dead, some very serious dispute. There's no clear, easy physiological sign, unlike in Munchkin Land, where apparently there's one very clear sign that you are dead, and that is your toes curl up. Now, I don't know if that is a particular aspect of Munchkin or witch physiology, but unfortunately we don't have such a clear symbol, so we have to muddle through it as best we can. It all started to get complicated at the time that this little device was created. This is the first ventilator, respirator, and it was invented in 1952. And for the first time, people lived a lot longer in dire conditions than they had before. At the turn of the last century, around 1900, William Osler, one of the greatest physicians in American history, had done a study where he looked at 100 successive admissions to the Johns Hopkins emergency room. And what he found was that a few months later, or even probably a few weeks later, almost every one of them was either home or dead, because there wasn't this capacity to maintain them for long periods of time using life support systems of various kinds while severe injuries were, while the body had a chance to repair severe injuries. And so we got to the point where we now had these people who, in some sense, seemed to be dying for very long periods of time, much longer than they would have been just a few years before. And so, eventually, that led to a question. If We can use machines to keep hearts beating and lungs inflated. It's difficult anymore to use a cardiovascular criteria for death, which had been the criteria for every society almost everywhere on Earth for all of human history. We need to appreciate what a profound change this was. If you talk about every society on Earth for all of human history using basically the same criteria to determine physiological death, and then all of a sudden in a moment of history, we say, no, that's not how you decide if someone is dead. We're going to use this other criteria that you can't see, you can't feel, you can't see on an X-ray, right? But you have to use sophisticated technological equipment to figure out. You've now changed the game significantly. For us, it all came together in 1974 in an ad hoc committee at Harvard University. And the reason that we developed and instituted brain death criteria, and still one of the main reasons we need it, though there are other reasons as well, is to harvest organs. Okay? We all understand that if you want my kidney, we can't wait for cardiovascular death, because by the time that happens, the kidney has lost its anoxic, it's lost oxygen, it has started to deteriorate. But if we can keep the heart and lungs going and say you're dead because your brain has stopped functioning, we can keep that kidney healthy for transplant. But in order to transplant, we first have to legally declare you dead. We can't legally declare you dead if your heart is beating and your lungs are operating unless we can find some other criteria, and that's why we develop brain death. It is a legal status. Whether it's a physiological status, this is important to understand. Whether someone is dead because their brain no longer functions, but their heart and lungs are still operating, is not a medical or physiological question. It's a philosophical and moral question. And it depends on how you decide to define death. Right? And not all the biological information in the world, if we had perfect understanding of the brain and hearts and lungs, it still would not answer that question. Because it depends on what you consider to be a living human being. So what brain death criteria became was a medical consensus encoded in law and used and became the legal standard. And think about that. It is intuitively nonsense. And I use nonsense reservedly. In other words, if you knew nothing about medicine and you walked into a room where someone's skin was pink, their heart was beating, their lungs were going, their bodies were functioning in every way, and someone said, that person is dead, all of your sort of human intuition would say, they're not dead. They look like every other living thing. I've seen things that are dead, and they don't look like that. And so there was this intuitive barrier we had to get over, and in some places we still haven't. In some places, very difficult. Part of the real struggle for cadaveric transplant in Japan, for example, is the Japanese public, they always had a slightly different view of personhood. It was thoracic, right? So in Japan, the site of personhood was not in the head, it was not even in the heart, it was in the gut. And that's why in Japan, when you perform seppuku or harakiri, you disembowel yourself. You don't cut your head off, because this is the site of personhood. So if you're Japanese and this part of the body is suffused with oxygen and operating, you're alive. It doesn't matter what's happening up here. And so cadaveric transplants have become, the medical establishment in Japan accepts them, but the people have a very hard time with it, and it's been much more difficult to get cadaveric transplants going in Japan than in the United States. Human did a study where he found 175 cases of people who were brain dead, that is legally declared dead, who lived anywhere from 1 to 14, 15 years. I'm about to show you someone who's still alive 15 years later. And it's important to know that that dead body, more counterintuitive stuff, that dead body on life supports, excuse me a second, how can a dead body be on life support? But that's how our language hasn't really caught up. So that's why I called it earlier, if you heard, organ support, not life support. That dead body, it engages in bodily homeostasis. It eliminates waste. It maintains body temperature. It can heal wounds. It can fight off infections. It can develop a febrile response. It has hormonal stress responses. It can gestate a fetus, which has happened. It matures sexually over time, and it grows proportionately. That's what that dead thing does. And so you can see why we have a definitional problem here, and why it is that the Munchkins seem to have it over us. Is this person dead? Well, there are two ways to decide. Cardiorespiratory death seems less problematic. Brain death seems necessary in our highly technological medical system. But even in brain death, we've got disputes about what we should use as the criteria for a dead brain. Is it the whole brain? Is it the brain stem that controls most of your basic physiological functions like breathing? Or is it just the higher brain? Is it consciousness? When that's gone, should we be considered dead? Which, by the way, led to a lot of controversy about anencephalic infants at one time who are born basically without the capacity for higher brain function. Are they dead at birth for our definition, and can we use them for transplants? Because at the time, I mean, we have many, many fewer of those children now because of prenatal ultrasound. But at one time, they were seen as a wonderful source because we don't have a lot of infant organs. There aren't that many infants that ride motorcycles or or do things without helmets so that we can get organs. Anyway, we don't have time for that argument. So, what does it mean to be absolutely dead? If you've never read The Forest People by Colin Turnbull, go out and buy it and read it tomorrow. It's one of the most wonderful, beautiful books. I love it. It's written in 1962. Colin Turnbull went and lived with the Bambuti, the pygmies of Africa. And when one of them looked really sick, he heard one of the pygmies say that so-and-so was dead. And he got very, very upset, only to find out later they suffered from a great fever. The pygmies express various degrees of illness by saying that someone is hot, with fever, ill, dead, completely or absolutely dead, and finally dead forever. So the pygmies have three categories of being dead, which don't correspond to our categories of being dead. Notice that it's Colin Turnbull's interpretation that these are all categories of illness, not death. That's because he brings his definition of what illness is to their definition of what death is. But those last three are not categories of being ill to the Bambuti, they're categories of being dead. That's why they use the term. And let's just finish this with one interesting problem, the problem of how we define death anyway. There's a fundamental philosophical problem that we don't generally think about. We define death by irreversibility. And to prove that, here's an article, International Perspectives on the Diagnosis of Death. There's a growing consensus. All human death involves the irreversible loss of the capacity for consciousness, combined with the irreversible loss of capacity to breathe. Death then is a result of the irreversible loss of these functions in the brain. The word irreversible 3 times in the second sentence. But is that true? If someone dies, or we think they die, and we manage through heroic measures to resuscitate them, they were, by definition, never dead. Doesn't matter physiologically what we found. If they were resuscitated, they could not have been dead because death is irreversible. So if we cryopreserve someone, if we cut off Ted Williams' head, which was done, and we cryopreserve it, which was done, and 1,000 years from now they figure out how to resuscitate Ted Williams and they bring him back, he was never dead. Because his death was not irreversible. It's just been reversed. Okay? And so we have a conceptual problem here with the idea of dead. We think of it as irreversible, but we leave the possibility that maybe it's not. If we remove irreversibility from the criteria, then we open up a whole other can of worms, because if this person's death is not irreversible, then why aren't you working to reverse it? Why aren't we digging up all the bodies in the graveyards and trying to resuscitate them? Because it's not irreversible, they're just dead. And so we have this interesting conceptual problem even about the very fundamental way that we define and think about death. Then we have application problems that Tammy knows so much better than I do, which is how we determine that there is complete cessation of brain activity. Even after what all of us might consider to be death of the brain, there's random electrical activity in the brain. Neurologists admit all the time that they examine, when you get a couple drinks in them or when you do a confidential survey, that they don't actually wait till complete and absolute cessation of all neuronal activity before they declare people dead. They've experienced, they know this person is dead. And yet, so this idea of complete cessation or whole cessation of the brain, then people talk about cessation of organized activity. We begin to hedge what cessation of activity means. So there really are problems with the way in which we physiologically define death. In Islam, a person has to be certified by 3 attending physicians to have irreversible brain damage of some kind, and then they're declared medically dead, except until he stops breathing, he is not legally dead. So in Islam, you can have this long gap between being declared physically dead and being declared legally dead. I'm afraid there's really very little I can do. Positively dead. This is another one we could spend a lot of time on. I'm going to be very brief here. That has to do with how, to scientists, positivity means measurement. And that is, how do we measure death? And I've already talked about that a little. It's a really interesting question. There's a lot of controversy about it. Dying is a process. Death itself is a process. And so even though we think of death as happening at 1 second, it doesn't necessarily happen at 1 second. And it depends how you define it to determine if it happens at 1 second. Then we had these problems that have really complicated the way in which we think about various stages of brain dysfunction going towards brain death, which is that people who were in persistent vegetative states, and even a few who were thought to be brain dead, it was discovered that they had certain kinds of responsive activity. We now call it minimally brain dead or minimal consciousness, showing brain activity in response to queries. So it wasn't just random activity, it was responsive activity. And so the measurement of how we determine death, we could give a whole talk on that, but I won't. I will say, however, that because of all of these controversies, there are a lot of people involved in thinking about and talking about dying and death in this country, and I'm very, very happy that the medical ethicist is the second one there. It shows that that cartoonist knows her stuff. Undeniably dead. What does it mean to say that someone is undeniably dead? Well, first of all, we're spending a lot of time and a lot of energy trying to deny death in general. I'm right in the middle of the baby boomer generation, and my generation has basically gotten everything we've wanted since we were kids, and now we're getting old, we're watching our parents die, and we've decided it's not going to happen to us. So all of these books are telling us how to make sure it doesn't, and then we also have decided that we're going to push death off years, decades, maybe forever. And there are a whole series of companies out there, anti-aging companies, that are trying to make sure that we don't die. My favorite is Immortality Incorporated, started by Robert Ettinger, who just died. Yes, he did. But they had the greatest byline of any company in the United States. I don't know who gives awards for great corporate byline, but he should have gotten an award for this, and it is, being born is not a crime, so why must it carry a death sentence? That's genius to me. But unfortunately, Bob will never be around to see whether Immortality, Inc. Fulfills its mission. Terri Schiavo, most of you remember this case. It was a dispute between her husband and her parents over whether Terri was actually dead. She was a remarkable person. She was, I'll come back to that in a second, really very much loved by her family. When she became unresponsive and eventually declared brain dead, her husband said that she had told him that she never wanted to live like that. The parents disputed that. And this issue of whether she had already died or not became part of the national dialogue. This is one cartoon showing by someone sympathetic to the idea that her body lived long beyond her actual death. And I have hundreds of Terri Schiavo cartoons. I've given many talks on her life and her death and this controversy, and I just picked two here because these show both sides of the controversy. This one shows, you probably can't read it, but it says, "Thank you, Michael," in the lines of her monitor. In other words, thank you for letting me die peacefully finally 15 years after my declared death. And this one is from the other side, gagging the idea that life is worth maintaining. This, by the way, is a picture of Terri Schiavo's brain. There is nothing here. That's from a previous operation, to piece of metal. This is all empty. I mean, anybody who knows anything about brain physiology will tell you that is not a human functioning brain in any sense whatsoever. That's what a healthy brain looks like. Anyway, so this was a very big controversy, and now we have another one, J. Hi McMath. How many of you have heard about her? Raise your hand. Okay, only 3 or 4 of you. This is a big ongoing controversy. J. Hi underwent an operation, did not come out of it, and was declared brain dead 15 years ago. This J.I. McMath declared brain dead 2 years ago, turns 15, I missed 2 years ago, turned 15 amid a legal battle. This was in the New York Daily News, 2 days ago, 3 days ago? This is her lawyer pointing to her brain, trying to show, this was a year ago, that in fact there's enough activity to merit calling her alive, despite the fact that neurologists had argued that there was no brain activity consonant with a living person. And this is their Facebook page and what they put up just the other day. I took this capture yesterday from the page. And last Saturday was her 15th birthday. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for the gift of life, the life you granted J. Hi, a life she so much deserves and desires. One of the things you see in both the Terri Schiavo case and the J. Hi case is the family interprets movement to be responsive. The healthcare team interprets the same movement as non-responsive. And so you have the conflict right there. It's all about your interpretation of this body. It is not, in some sense, about the body itself. And then finally, what is it? And that's, we say J. Hi is dead, or the medical team says she's dead. The family denies it. Michael Schiavo said Terri was dead. Her parents denied it. So undeniably dead is not an unproblematic category. And finally, I'll end with reliably dead. Does anybody know what this is? So this is a picture of someone who is in a casket and will be buried with a string going up to a bell outside their grave. So in case they wake up in the coffin, they can start ringing the bell and be dug back up. Because it isn't just now that we have disputes over what it means to be dead and what it means to be alive and how we make that determination. So the coroner decides that she's not only merely dead, she's really most sincerely dead. And first I'd just like to, before we finish, nod to Yip Harburg, the lyricist for Wizard of Oz. I think this song is utterly brilliant, as you can see by the fact that I've given a talk about it, and he was a brilliant lyricist throughout. And I will end simply by saying that though I've talked about how problematic it is to determine death, perhaps even more problematic is determining undeath. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. What a great beginning. I'll invite Dr. Quest to say a few words and then both to join the table for a discussion with them. Please.
So thanks, Corey. So Paul is always a hard act to follow, but let me try. So my name's Tammy Quest, and I'm a emergency physician, which Corey didn't say, but also I'm a palliative care physician, and it's what I do most of the time. And in that role in my life, I take care of people in many different areas of the spectrum of living and dying. And some of you, how many people here know what palliative care is? So I would probably argue that most people know what it is, but there's a lot of confusion often. So I'm going to tell you what it is, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the problems, and I won't spend a lot of time because we want to have discussion. So palliative care is the physical, spiritual, psychological, and social aspect of caring for patients and families with serious, life-threatening illness from diagnosis to death or cure. Death or cure of a life-threatening illness. That is to be distinguished from hospice care, which many of you may be familiar with, which by definition, to get hospice care, you must have a terminal illness that has a limited time period, 6 months or less, if the disease runs its usual course. So when I take care of patients, it would be foolish to say as a physician that I have no idea when I think you would die. In fact, I often have a pretty good idea, and there's pretty good statistics that are fairly reliable. However, whether patients or families actually believe when that time period might be is more of the issue. And in our country, patients who get hospice care, that when you have a terminal illness and the doctors believe that you have 6 months or less if the disease runs its usual course, get less than 20 days of hospice care in this country. And the reasons for that are multifactorial, but not the least of which, nobody wants to talk about dying, and nobody wants to say, I don't think you have very long left. And so in my role as a palliative medicine physician, I am always supporting patients and families, and it really goes with the Munchkin Code of Ethics, physically, spiritually, psychologically, and socially, because suffering occurs in a multidimensional fashion. Support needs to occur like that as well. So I would say that 1940 was, around the 1940s, was a very difficult time for our country. Paul started at 1952, but actually in the 1940s is when we got antibiotics. And before the 1940s, essentially, penicillin was, I think, invented in 1942, and we had some other agents before then. But actually, before 1940, there was only really 3 ways to leave this planet, and it actually continues to be only 3 ways to leave this planet. 1 is infection. 2 is anything that makes you stop eating or drinking. And number 3 is some traumatic event that actually causes one of the 2 of those other things. So before 1940, essentially in this world, we didn't have ways of extending your life, and actually that was normal dying. And with the advent of antibiotics, ventilators, and in 1951, the feeding tube, all of a sudden we transformed this idea that people just got sick and died from something, and they died at home and it all looked okay. All of a sudden we started, as I like to call, mucking with it. And we've been mucking with it pretty aggressively to the point where now we're kind of convinced that these artificial things that we have that we've not had for very long are actually the answer to dying. So much of what I spend my time doing, and other people in this audience that I see very close to me here, is actually sitting with patients and families who are struggling with things like life support machines, feeding tubes, and should we get more antibiotics. Now, in the last 24 hours, and even right now, I'm getting, poor Mark here, here's my phone going off, I'm on call. And so I'm texting back, I'll call you back in a minute. In the last 24 hours, I've dealt with a brain death case. First call this morning when I woke up was to the intensive care unit to say, hey, did they determine that this person's going to be lifelink organ donation, or what are we doing this morning? And they were in between the first and second death exams, because you actually don't, when you're getting declared for brain death, it's just not one examination, it's 2 examinations that need to occur so that we're really sure, irrespective of the fact if your family would agree with that. But as I say to my families, and what Paul said so eloquently, is that death is an event, but dying is a process. And how it is that we conceptualize that as patients, as family members, as caregivers, as a society, is enormously complex. And this idea that we have control of it is you have very short memories. 1940 is when we start thinking that we had control of it. Before that, you just actually went home, you got into a sleepy state, and you died. You got hot with fever, yeah, you probably had blood infection. Guess what? Those things still happen, but now 1 in 5 Americans is going to die in the intensive care unit on a life support machine with things blowing, dripping, and whistling. That's what everybody in this room is signed up to get unless you make other plans. So what I would say here is I had a really wonderful meeting yesterday with a young man's mother who he's in his 30s and he's got a severe advancing cancer. He's on very serious chemotherapy, even in his advanced stage. The mother is waiting for the oncologist, because I said, tell me what you're thinking is happening, and she says, I'm worried that he's not doing well. We heard that a while back, but I'm waiting for the oncologist to tell me. We're doing this chemotherapy now, but I'm waiting for the oncologist to tell me something. And I said, what are you afraid of? So I'm actually just trying to help her, tell me what you're afraid of. And then I named it. Are you afraid of him dying? Just named it, because she just wouldn't name it. And she said, I was afraid of him dying until last week, but he got saved. He wasn't a Christian, and he professed and he got saved last week. I'm okay now because I know I'm going to see him again. So what I would say is, in the absolutely, positively, certainly, are you dead, the physical, spiritual, moral, ethical continuum, I like to call that the continuum of peace. And different people reach peace with whatever's going on at different times. We can often give you more days on the planet with things that are blowing and dripping and pushing and whistling and all of those things, but they may or may not be the kinds of days that you want. So I'm going to stop there and open it to questions.
Any questions for our speakers? I could not have dreamed of a better way to start today's conference, but there you are. Anything from the floor? Please.
So this is going back to the idea of like death being So I know that this is a fictional example, but like what about the influence of Frankenstein, where he made these dead bodies and brought to life, like where bodies were dead?
Well, that's a really interesting question for the following reason. Someone is declared dead, and we take their kidney, and we put it in you. Now, when we declare someone dead, we assume they're all dead. But that kidney was dead in that the body it was in was declared dead, and now it's alive. So we think pieces can be dead non-irreversibly, right? So maybe if you have a lot of pieces together, you can put them all together and have a human being who is alive with all of their pieces once having been dead. Again, it's not a logical problem, it's a philosophical problem, and you can probably answer it a lot of different ways.
And I've had patients who would like the cryogenic option. And so talking to people about this, it's really, they don't freeze their whole body, mostly. They just freeze their brain. Like, most people just want to freeze their head. Like, they're like, I don't care what all the rest of it looks like. I just want my head to be, I want my brain, I want my feeling. I mean, they don't care about their body. So it's very interesting when I talk to my patients who are, hey, I'd love to have the freezing option, is really that the center of the universe for the people that I've encountered happens to be the brain. And so, I mean, I don't think that they would care if they came back Frankenstein-ish, as long as their brain was awake, which, as you can imagine, the Frankenstein isn't like the big, lightning bolt that kind of goes through their brain, and everything starts working. So.
But let me say a quick thing about that, because as some of you know, neuroscience and ethics is my specialty. I've always found it fascinating that we have that perspective. It's a very new perspective historically. Most people in most times in history, and even today in many places, do not consider selfhood to be in the brain. That Japanese thoracic personhood I talked about, the second largest nervous system that we have after the brain is the gut. And we have absolutely no idea, that if you took off my head and put it on Tammy's body, how much of that would be me and how much of that would be Tammy. We just don't know. We assume that all of this is in our brains, but actually we don't know. It's an assumption. We don't really understand, because it's never been done experimentally, how much the rest of our nervous system contributes to all of that we think of as being us. Well, we may see, because they're about to do the first human head transplant. Well, they have declared that they are going to. It's been done on dogs. It's been done on monkeys. They've lived a fairly short amount of time. And there's someone who's dying with a musculoskeletal disease who has agreed that to have his head transplanted onto another body to extend his life. Whether it will actually happen or not, I don't know. I'm skeptical. But it was actually announced that it was agreed that it would happen. You sound like a Bambuti.
So I think I'll answer that in a more general sense and then a little more specific. So one of the most disturbing things for families, so typically not the patient, right, because the patient is incapacitated. The most disturbing things for the family is actually set of complex neurologic responses that occur that are really primal and wired into the deep brain. And as we've talked about, sort of what part of your brain has to be dead, there are pieces of your brain that, even in brain death, may be functioning, and this is always really troubling to people. Interestingly, the criteria for brain death medically on a daily basis is not scanned for brain activity. Okay, so if we did a quote unquote PET scan or something, a nuclear image of your brain as the criteria for brain death, meaning that nothing in your brain, like that image would have to be black and nothing is working, that's actually not the criteria. We have criteria around breathing on your own and those sorts of things that are in the deep brain. But it doesn't make, brain death doesn't have the entire brain shut down 100%. It's just that the pieces of the brain that would components of the brain that control specifically breathing and certain types of reflexes are evaluated. Brain death is not declared based on an image. It's based on a number of clinical findings that we do actually at the bedside. No pictures are taken. So therefore, it is not unusual for patients to have some kinds of unpredictable reflexes, which typically, in the case of brain death, would be minimal. But in persistent vegetative state, for instance, it's extremely common to have all kinds of things that are happening. And in fact, if you read the Terri Schiavo chronicles, most of what the debate was between her husband and parents was the parents were fairly convinced that she was making eye contact, that she was responding to specific things. And so really the issue is the brain, while we say it's brain dead, we're really talking about key core functions that we've defined as part of brain death. And over time, if you do scans, that goes to nothingness. But there are these time periods and these disturbing things that can happen with people who are on the continuum of particularly between persistent vegetative state and brain death. And so these very troubling for patients and for families. And then it's very troubling really because if you look at your advance directive that you check off for the state, it says, actually, if I am in a persistent vegetative state with no meaningful chance of recovery, there are all of these gray things. And so your surrogates will angst over what that means. And so I try to help people think about another concept, which is what is the minimal acceptable outcome for which you believe this person would want to live. Because it's not actually about can they move, can they twitch, can they do this. What is the minimal acceptable global outcome? And I've shared this publicly with other people before. I don't have that much of a premium for me on physical attributes of my body. That said, I think that I'm pretty healthy. I'm running a marathon next weekend. I mean, these are good things to have. But I'm not so sure that if I had an illness that made me not be able to walk or move, that would bother me as much as a fraction of the loss of my brain capacity. And so the issue there is for any individual person, what is the minimal acceptable outcome? If I took a brain hit and couldn't do all the things that I love, that would really be bad for me, and it wouldn't have to be persistent vegetative state or brain death. And that's really where, as we give patients and families very difficult choices, and we don't really couch it into something that's real, like what's important to them, then we get into all of these things like I want to see the picture, and I want to see if their brain is lighting up, and I want to do these things, and it's very difficult.
One quick other comment. The thing that sunk the anencephalic, so anencephaly is when you're born with most of your brain usually, or most of your higher brain functions missing. And so the idea was you have these infants, and you die anywhere from immediately to a few weeks usually at the most. And the idea was these children cannot survive. They've got healthy bodily organs. We need infant organs, should we? And on one side were, by the way, parents, surgeons, organ donors, the healthcare system, all of whom said, yes, this is an invaluable resource. And on the other side were people from religious communities, many ethicists, who said, no, we don't kill people because you can't wait for this infant to die. What sunk it, the reason it was never actually allowed, was because when people heard, in order to take these organs out, you have to anesthetize the child, or else there will be responses, pain responses. That's what sunk the anencephalic movement. And so there you have the implication of your question right there. A response to pain is seen very powerfully by people as some acknowledgement of being alive.
Right, we call them essentially signs of life. Mm-hmm. And when people feel the hardest choice that families and surrogates make is removing their loved one from life-sustaining therapy. And often the moment of struggle is the movement, is the twitch, is that because their expectation somehow is that they need to be completely gone for us to do this. And we're just not wired reflexively to be completely gone that often.
So I want to keep us, my task is to keep us on task. And please join me in thanking the panelists for this wonderful opening. There will be more time over the course of the day to address this question about the definition of death. It will be carried as the major theme that will run through the next 3 panels. Let's just take 2 minutes to refresh ourselves. There are too many things to eat, so please eat them all at the very back. But just before you take this 2-minute break, and we'll be very prompt, I just wanted to let you know that this conversation will actually carry much further than this conference. The neuroethics program that is directed by Dr. Karen Rommelfanger is hosting a discussion on November 17th called Will Head Transplants Create an Entirely New Person? That will be facilitated by Dr. Jordan Amadeo, who's an Emory neurosurgeon. As you can imagine, that filled up the moment it was launched. There's a waiting list, I think, but we'll keep the information out there in case this kind of topic and these deep abiding issues with neuroscience at the intersection of ethics is important to you. I'll keep the flyer outside if you want to connect to Dr. Rommelfanger's work. So let's take 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Neely. Thank you so much, Paul. That was just so great. Of course, 25 questions. And I'm like, but it's great. Thank you. Thank you. This is great. Godspeed. Be careful in your drive. Thanks. Oh, wonderful. Corey. So great to meet you. Do you have, are you speaking off the cuff or?
I know.
Chat? Wonderful. Okay.
Clicker. Okay. And just forward back. Okay.
Allison, is it okay that I keep that on, or should I turn it off in between?
At this age, but I would just take the
Turn it off.
I just hope that I'm more keeping them on. I'm not sure how much yeah, and I'm not sure how much he's suffering from not being able to see. But anyway, we'll have to catch up on that. Okay, is it you could be
Please. Sure. Oh no, that's more. Do you want me to take you in the picture?
Oh, can
Yeah, that's more. Okay. I don't want me to ruin the picture for you.
But this is such a nice touch.
It is. It is.
So, are you all set? Do you need some more? No, I'm okay.
Right.
Okay,
I think I got it.
Yeah.
Good.
Writing on a
I appreciate you guys doing
No, this is always fun. Yeah, it's always fun.
It's great. I'm going to have to leave after the next drink, so I have
Yeah.
to go meet a repair person at my house.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah.
It says
Like,
dad.
I'm going to go at least catch the first couple.
I hear you. Yeah, that was really fun. Thank you. Thank you for being here. It's great. Those are mine. Yeah.
I don't think I know you yourself, so we can't tell what you're doing.
Oh,
It's just real fast, a little bit of instructional information. We are recording just